Rachel and I have been involved with elk research now for 20 years. Actually, I have. She's a little too young to go back that far, but we've been involved with nutrition research with elk and some other species for a little over 17 years. We've done two types of research in all these years, one focusing on collecting data from wild animals, and the other focused on collecting data from tame animals. The wild animal work has been done over an extremely broad geographic area, mainly to better understand how nutrition influences population dynamics and how limiting nutrition might be. The work with the tame animals was to better understand nutritional requirements of these animals, get a better understanding between relationships between nutrition and performance, and to get a better idea of how habitat management or habitat conditions might influence animal performance through nutritional pathways. And it's that latter aspect that I'll be talking about more today. We have not done any studies of thinning effects on elk nutrition and foraging dynamics at all. We have collected a little bit of data that might shed some light on the topic. And basically what I'll be trying to do here in the next few minutes is extrapolate that data that we've collected to a thinned setting to better understand what one might expect. With 15 years of nutrition research, we're kind of rewriting the book in terms of habitat, nutrition, big game relationships, or at least elk relationships. There's some big misconceptions. The first one that I'd like to drop on you here is that in terms of all those ways that habitat can influence population dynamics, at least of elk populations, the most important by far and away are nutritional mechanisms. This is based on 12 years of research in 5 states where we have looked at nutrition effects on wild elk herds from southern Colorado to the Dakotas, to the Pacific coast near Forks, Washington, down into southwest Oregon. 22 elk herds, 12 years of work, twice a year capture operations to measure body fat, reproduction, pregnancy, and those kind of things. We've handled about 3,000 elk over these 12 years. What we have found is that nutrition effects have more limiting effects than we ever suspected based on past literature. These effects often influence population performance that generally goes detected with normal sampling procedures of state game organizations. I would like to say as well, in case there are some residual perceptions out there, that there is no empirical evidence collected in North America that shows that thermal cover affects population dynamics of these animals. None. The second thing I'd like to point out is that this perception or hypothesis that summer nutrition is ubiquitously good across the board, that it does not have limiting effects on population performance, is being rejected based on our data that we collected in the study I was just talking about, as well as studies conducted worldwide. Animals are productive in the summer. They reproduce, they breed, youngsters grow. All those things are important in terms of population performance and vital rates. All are nutrient demanding processes that occur in the summertime. The nutrient requirements that time of year are very high. The old assumption has always been that summer forage was plenty good enough to satisfy those needs, and in fact, that's just not true. The long-standing perception that limitations occur only in the wintertime, if you take a good look, hard look at the literature, you will not find hardly any support for that idea. The upshot is a kind of a change in if we're going to improve habitats for big game or for elk. We got to get away from thinking about food plots on winter range. That is not the answer to the issue. The third item I'd like to point out, and this kind of came up earlier in a talk today, there's a long-standing belief that somehow protein is the driver, the currency of concern. the nutritional currency of concern. A lot of livestock literature and a lot of our own data shows that actually it's digestible energy content of forage that's the driver of most productive processes such as lactation, juvenile growth, fat accretion, breeding dynamics, and that kind of thing. Deficiencies in digestible energy in food that these animals eat during the summer for lactating females and their offspring at heel can be devastating. This is a graph that I've been showing now for 12 years based on work we did back in 1995. And almost everybody on the west side, I think except you guys, have probably seen this, but what this shows is 3 levels of nutrition fed to lactating cow elk in the summertime and their body fat accretion dynamics. There's a couple of stories to tell with this, but the main story I want you to kind of lock into your mind is that very small differences in the quality of forage as measured by digestible energy content of the food has huge effects on performance. In this case, a 20% difference in digestible energy content resulted in a 5-fold difference in body fat accumulation. These effects were apparent in these studies with calf growth, yearling growth, pregnancy rates, ability to survive through winter, basically anything that we could measure in those old studies. The fourth item, it's really nothing new, it's just kind of change our direction a little bit. The daily acquisition rate of digestible energy is the game these animals play in the summertime in terms of satisfying their nutritional requirements. Daily acquisition rate is a function of the digestible energy content of the food that they eat and how fast they eat it, which is in turn a function of how abundant that food is and the bite size of that food. It has big implications for trying to understand what thinning might do to the forage base for these animals. In practice, it turns out that DE levels in forage need to average about 2.7 kilocalories per gram of food. For some of you, 58% in vitro digestibility will make more sense. So that's kind of a standard that we have found in our research that's turning out to have a lot of implications that I won't go into here. In many plant communities in the Pacific Northwest, particularly on the west side, our data indicate that those palatable species that satisfy this level of nutritional requirement are very rare. There's a lot of vegetation in the plant communities in the west side. There's a lot of vegetation, some of the most productive plant communities in the world, but most of it is crap. That's the problem. The challenge for a biologist then that wants to improve habitat to benefit elk or even deer nutritionally is to increase the abundance of these palatable and nutritious species, increase their abundance so that there's enough out there to do these animals some good. That's what this boils down to. Elk are arguably the most studied species on the planet, perhaps maybe second to white-tailed deer, and maybe even now spotted owls. Certainly one of the most studied species in the world. We do not have the knowledge or capability to improve forage in a way that we know will benefit at the population level to this day. Well, we use tame elk to get a better handle on some of this stuff. A lot of people criticize our use of tame elk, but we have a lot of wild elk data to back up what we're saying with tame elk that I won't go into today. And the way we used them in the context of today's presentation is these are tame animals, bottle raised. We put them in a trailer and brought them over on the west side. We now have almost a decade of data going back to the year 20,000. Year 2000. We have 3 years of data on the west side, Western Oregon and Washington, collected in 2000 through 2002. We have 3 years in the Blue Mountains on the east side, 2004 through 2006. And this summer, we had another round in Southwest Oregon to fill some gaps in our knowledge. Some of you may be familiar that this data is being used to develop new elk habitat evaluation models for the west side. These animals were brought in to a variety of habitats. We threw up electric pins, about 1 hectare in size. We would record what they eat, measure the nutrient levels of the forage that they got, how fast they ate the forage, and that kind of thing. So from that, our goal here is to learn what it is about plant communities that make it or break it nutritionally for these animals. When they're in hand like this, you can learn an awful lot. 3 study areas in the early days: the Nooksack country in the northern Cascades, the Willapa Hills, southwest Washington, Springfield area in western Oregon. This summer we worked down in the Roseburg, Grants Pass, Gold Beach, Medford country from the crest of the Cascades to the ocean. So we have data now that extends from the California border to the California border, from the crest of the Cascades to the ocean. We'll start at the simplest level. Turns out these animals like some species, plant species, and these animals don't like others. Turns out that it has huge implications in the nutritional ecology of these animals. Those plants that the animals do not eat them for a very important reason. This is a graph that shows the standing biomass or standing mass of plants that they do eat. That's on the x-axis. And on the y-axis is the digestible energy level of the food that they eat. This is actual diets. This is that magical 2.7 kcals per gram of requirement that they need just to maintain their body fat while raising a calf. Not good performance, just to maintain where they are. What these data indicate is they need about 400 kilograms per hectare of that good food for these animals to make a living. If they're below that, they're going to nosedive. If they're down around 2.2 kcals and that's what they have to live off of and they have a calf at heel, let me tell you, it's bad news. Well, all right, before I go on, the 2 lines, MHZ is Mountain Hemlock Zone, Pacific Silver Fir Zone, and then the red data in the red line is Western Hemlock Zone. So you get an elevation effect here that is pretty important. This is a slide that goes back quite a few years too, and every time I use this slide, I want to just crawl under the podium here and kind of die, because I got to replace it one of these days. But in terms of those avoided and accepted species, there's a successional gradient over a 700-year period that's really pretty important in understanding what's going on, mainly in the Western Hemlock Zone of Western Oregon and Washington. In the first 10 to 15 years after clear-cut logging, there is a fairly good abundance, about 400 to 500 kilograms per hectare of forage that actually meets their needs. After age 20, all the way out through the full extent of plant succession that we have data for, up to 700 years, the amount of this biomass averages less than 50 kilograms per hectare. There was a perception that was really prevalent in the mid-1990s that for some reason in the old growth forest, that the amount of this good elk forage would increase substantially, and thus old growth stands would provide the nutritional needs of these animals. This data set does not support that contention at all. If you take this 50 kilograms per hectare production and plot it on this graph, what you will see here is that basically all stands beyond age 15 or 20 really don't have the ability to support productive animals in the summertime. Pretty much a ubiquitous kind of thing. Well, working with the P&W station of the Forest Service and taking that data, we've now developed some nutrition mapping algorithms that have been combined with all the telemetry data sets ever collected on elk on the west side to build this new elk habitat model. And what I'm showing here is what I'm calling a nutrition succession trajectory that shows a relationship between plant succession and expected nutritional outcomes of foraging elk. For the Nooksack country, for the Willapa Hills, for the Springfield study areas. Just in one habitat type, if you want to call it that, the Western Hemlock Sword Fern Plant Association group, defined very loosely. Well, this has a lot of value in understanding what's going on or integrating plant succession patterns with elk nutrition and oak nutritional needs. And I could go on and on about this, but moving on, we did collect a little bit of data in thin stands during the course of this work. This is in the Nooksack country. We had data from 7 thin stands. These are all on corporate timberlands, commercial thins. This is what we got. I didn't apply a statistical test for this presentation. What you see here is a suggestion of an improvement of a very small amount, about 1/10 of a kilocalorie per gram of food. Well, that can be significant, but just note that these levels in the thin stands are still far below that magical 2.7 kilocalorie need. In the Willapa Hills, this is what the data looked like. Now again, this wasn't a study to determine thinning effects on nutrition of elk, so I don't know if you should place a lot of stock in it. Well, this summer, we got a whole new perspective on west side vegetation. Southwest Oregon is a floristically incredibly diverse area. All that country further north where it's wetter is not very diverse, either within or among stands. And it kind of got a different perspective on this, and this work finished as of 2 days ago. So I have no real data to present. All I have is a series of slides. There's a couple of things that seem to jump out. If we're going to be able to ever predict how to improve forage for big game, we need a predictive framework that combines what we know about overstory density management and nutritional value, resultant nutritional value. We need to integrate data of ungulate nutritional ecology with vegetation community ecology. In other words, we need to know what it is about plant communities that drive nutritional responses, and then we need to know how these attributes change from one ecological setting to the next across disturbance regimes and across time via succession. That's the game that we're playing if we're ever going to be able to predict the value of thinning for big game. A couple of examples here. I'm running out of time, but I'm going to jump through a couple of these maybe to demonstrate this and then call it good. Plant association groups, as defined in the U.S. Forest Service system in their ecological classification, there are a bunch of these. There's several hundred in Southwest Oregon. But what we found is that those plant communities that support primarily evergreen shrubs in the understory in late successional stages, things like salal, evergreen huckleberry, rhododendron, and sword fern, ubiquitously provide a very poor foraging substrate. This is kind of what they look like. You probably can't see that very well. Similarly, down in the Gold Beach country, those plant communities in late cereal stages that support manzanita, madrone, tan oak, evergreen, huckleberry, and ceanothus are awful as well. At high elevation, we found further north that nutrition can be very good in high elevation, but further south where you pick up these cool, dry communities that support grouse whortleberry, princess pine, manzanita, and some of these other evergreen things, again, are pretty bad. These are old growth conditions that I'm talking about now, and these aren't diverse communities. They support virtually nothing but these evergreen shrubs and provide very poor foraging substrate for elk. On the other hand, we're running into plant association groups that support a very diverse forb community with a scattering of very palatable deciduous shrubs such as schooler's willow, cascara, ocean spray might kind of fall into that category, a few of those kind of things. And even in fairly dense overstory settings, you can have enough production of this stuff that nutrition levels are pretty good. Those plant association groups that support pretty much complete dominance of evergreen shrubs in the understory, when they're opened up, very often support the same thing in just greater abundance. To make a long story short, our data so far suggests there's not a whole lot you can do in those plant communities in any way, shape, or form, burning, short of using herbicides, burning, thinning, or whatever to improve the forage base. But in those stands, or those plant association groups that have the potential to support the more diverse forb communities with these palatable shrubs provides much more opportunities. This is Gold Beech manzanita types. This has been burned twice in the last 10 years. The trees are removed. We got a lot of manzanita and such things. This is about a 20-year-old stand in the same area, same plant community, just more of it. This is an old growth stand with an underburn, rhododendron, manzanita, 100 feet up the hill. This one had been thinned. Oh, this looks pretty good. First glance, a lot of green there, but it's the same plant community. The elk in this pen wandered around and found salal berries to eat, and that was the extent of it. Okay, I've exceeded my time limits. What I was going to do with this was propose an ecological land classification system that would combine all this data in a way that would mean something in a predictive format for managers to use. We are able to populate the cells in this array with the data we collected to some extent. When we get through analyzing it, I think that will be very beneficial. But that's what it boils down to. If we are going to do a good job of improving the forage base, the nutritional status of animals through habitat management, we have to understand the relationship of these ecological patterns in light of disturbance regimes relative to how animals use these plant communities nutritionally. I'm done.